Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Committee of the Whole on Monday, March 18th. I'll now call this meeting to order. Roll call, Madam.
Schultz.
Here.
Latta.
Here.
Cruz.
Here.
Hallbaker. Ganfield.
Here.
Chrisman. Dunn.
Here.
All members present.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We'll move on to item number 1, discussion of the city's current conflict of interest disclosure requirements. Presentation from Bailey.
Hi, Mayor and City Council. For those of you who haven't officially met me, my name is Bailey Schindel, Human Resource Manager with the city. Today I'll be talking to you guys about our current conflict of interest forms and the process that goes along with that. The Personnel Policy 2407, Conflicts of Interest, is what prompts and enforces our conflict of interest form process. The blurb shown here is straight from the policy itself. The policy prohibits elected and appointed officials and employees from engaging in activities that unlawfully conflict with or appear to conflict with the interest of the city. To comply with state law, and I'll touch on that more later, the city requires all full-time, permanent part-time, and certain special purpose employees to sign an annual declaration of compliance with the conflicts of interest policy. This is done each year around December. Real quick, just going through some general guidance of what this personnel policy says. For employees, there is no employment allowed with any organization that does business with the city that would be considered a conflict of interest. Regarding outside employment, we also have a separate policy on that. It's CFD 2110 that states that employees must obtain prior approval before accepting outside employment if there's a potential conflict of interest. Under the personnel policies, employees must disclose any financial interest that they or their family has in any organization that does business with the city. And lastly, employees and city officials are not to accept gifts that have a value of $3 or greater, and that is per Iowa code. Again, per our conflict of interest personnel policy, employees and city officials are not allowed to give, offer, or promise anything of value to anyone in connection with any city transaction. Employees and city officials are prohibited from misusing material inside information prior to public disclosure. And lastly, employees and city officials should exercise care so that no personal correspondence appears to be an official communication from or by the city. Conflict of interest forms are important to the city for 3 main reasons. Number 1 is that it helps us comply with Code of Iowa 68B2A, which has to deal with outside employment or activities that conflict with the person's official duties or responsibilities, including the following situations: using time or resources to give themselves or family an advantage that is not available to the public, using a badge, uniform, business card, etc. to benefit themselves or a family member. This does not apply to off-duty peace officers or firefighters. They are still able to work outside off-duty security jobs, for example, maybe helping out like at UNI, performing security at an event. That would still be allowed, using their badge, uniform, city equipment. Even in that situation, though, off-duty jobs are reviewed by leadership and public safety. This section of code also prohibits receiving money in exchange for work duties, for performing regular work duties in public employment. Lastly, it prohibits employment in areas under the regulatory control of public employment positions, for example, inspection, review, audit, or enforcement authority. The second reason conflict of interest forms are important is because it helps us stay compliant with Iowa Code 362.5, which has to deal with interest in public contracts that is prohibited. Under this code section, the city is prohibited from having any contracts for goods or services that benefit a city officer or employee that exceeds $6,000 in a fiscal year. To make sure that we are complying with this, all city contracts, projects, and vendor activities are reviewed when looking at potential conflicts that are disclosed to us. And the third reason that we find conflict of interest forms beneficial are for audit purposes. So GASB, or the Government Accounting Standard Board, Section 62, requires disclosure of transactions between related parties. Each year, after conflict of interest forms are handed in and reviewed, Finance prepares a related party work paper if potential conflicts are found. That related party work paper is then submitted to our auditors, our finance auditors, for them to use in their preliminary field work. This report helps auditors run various audit tests to obtain reasonable assurances that city's financial statements are free from material misstatement, whether to error or fraud. If the city did have a related party transaction and we didn't disclose that appropriately, the city could be found to have a material misstatement or adverse audit opinion. Lastly, the existence of conflict of interest policy and procedures helps auditors in evaluating the city's internal controls and how well those internal controls are working to prevent fraud or misstatement. So as mentioned earlier, we have the 3 conflict of interest forms for employee, boards and commission members, and elected officials. Shown here is the employee form. At the top, it cites the personnel policies for conflict of interest in outside employment. Employees would list their potential conflicts on the 3 lines close to the top there. The line in the middle is where employees would list any outside employment. Or if there are no conflicts or no outside employment, there's a space to check that as well. The employee then signs and dates, and the form gets reviewed by their manager and director. The completed form gets reviewed by HR and finance, and the ones that have conflicts listed or outside employment listed would then go to finance to review and track for audit purposes that we previously discussed. All forms are then filed away in employee personnel files. Shown here is the conflict of interest form for boards and commission members. At the top is some verbiage on avoiding conflicts of interest and recusing self from any action that pertains to a potential conflict of interest. Again, the 3 lines, they would state any potential conflicts or list none. Sign, date, and all of those conflict of interest forms for board and commission members are then reviewed by the city administrator before being filed away. And lastly, here is an example of the current elected officials' conflict of interest form. Again, at the top, there's verbiage about avoiding conflict of interest, and it references the city policies on conflict of interest and outside employment policies. In the middle is the 3 lines, space to disclose any potential conflicts of interest or otherwise state none. And then you sign at the bottom. In the past, upon completion of these have been received and filed by City Council on an annual basis. So with that was kind of a general overview of our city policies, practices, and procedures in regards to our current conflict of interest form. This topic was a council referral item. We did receive an example of a financial disclosure statement from Councilmember Hawbaker. There's 3 pages of it. They can be seen here, 1st page, 2nd page, and 3rd page. These are not in the packet, but you should have hard copies in front of you. So at this point, I can pass it over to Councilmember Hawbaker for discussion or the council for discussion.
Thank you, Bailey.
Thank you, guys.
And I will just move it over to you, Aaron, if you want to kind of recap just for people's information what we're discussing.
Sure. First of all, it's my fault that the example of the Iowa Dixie Campaign Disclosure Board didn't make it to the packet because I got it to staff late, but I appreciate you putting it in the presentation. Is it not working?
There it is now.
No, I have to be closer. Okay. Yeah, I am responsible for the referral, and really it started with when I was signing up with HR and looking at the conflict of interest form and seeing how In my opinion, it was inadequate to address what conflicts of interest are. And if you think about it, it's the skinniest acknowledgement for us as opposed to employees of the city who have to provide additional information. In my world, I'm a supervisor with the executive branch of the state of Iowa, and they require the personal financial disclosure statement that you have there, which basically goes to the heart of what I consider to be actual conflicts of interest as opposed to perceived conflicts of interest, and that is, where do you make your money, okay? And so we have to disclose this to the public, and that way, if we're involved in the decision, then the public would know what our interests were, and they could make their decision about whether or not that was an informed, non-biased decision in my role in state government, or if I was impugned in some way because of a financial interest that I had. And that is lacking in the form that we have right now. How can you determine whether or not I or anybody else on the council has a conflict of interest when you don't know what my interests are? The form asks for potential conflicts of interest. That list could go on forever as far as what a potential conflict of interest is. For example, we see often on council agenda a particular property that's getting assessed for not mowing their lawn or taking care of the weeds or taking care of their sidewalks. If a particular property was a family member of mine, that's a conflict of interest. If a particular property was a very close friend of mine, that's a conflict of interest. How many pages do I have to then provide as a matter of disclosure, since they're all situational, dependent upon the circumstance that's brought to the council? So it's impossible to put that in a form and a commitment. What I do like about the form is it's a commitment that the council members have to follow the standards that are set out by the city. What I don't like about the form is that it's sort of bare as to what your relationships are, our relationships are in the community. I do think it needs to be revamped, and we should look at the financial interests not only of the council members, but in all likelihood spouses, since I think a direct pecuniary interest could be affected in that regard. And then the council member obviously is always duty bound to follow the conflict of interest policies of the city, but the voting public and everybody out there would know better where our interests lie, and they can have their own assessment about whether or not an individual council member accurately determined whether or not they had a conflict of interest. And so I'm ultimately asking that we revamp that disclosure form.
So I think for tonight's discussion, it is just looking at, are we wanting to give staff direction to look at revamping the conflict of interest form? Are we interested in adopting a different requirement? So I'll just kind of open it up to thoughts and questions.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilmember Plata.
question for Attorney Rogers. How difficult is it or is it not to, based on the way the Iowa Code is written, determine validity to a perceived conflict of interest if one's being posed?
Our policy when it talks about perception, it talks about a perceived conflict of interest in the interests of the city. Well, somebody could believe that they're acting in the interests of the city. So as council, what I was going to say is, if we're going to get down to perceived conflicts of interest, as Aaron said, that's a never-ending possibility. So I think what's driving this is actual conflicts of interest, and those can be pecuniary, it can be personal, as was mentioned, and I think this form gets more at the pecuniary. Also potential, as he mentioned as well, potential is also hard to see coming, but I think everybody can understand if I become involved in a company that frequently does business with the city, although there's not a current contract, certainly you could see that's coming probably, and that's a potential conflict of interest. That's an easy one. There are harder ones that Councilmember Hawbaker alluded to. So I'm not so hung up on the perceived. Also with perceived, whose perception are we talking about here?
Sure.
And so There are plenty of ways that council can inform the public on actual pecuniary conflicts. And at some point on the perceived, it comes down to your personal ethics too. And, you know, if it's not directly a legal conflict, if you're influenced in your decision-making unfairly, then that's a conflict of interest. And I would add too, once, this is a great tool that we're talking about here, but ultimately it's the council members' responsibility to inform their colleagues and stay out of the discussion. And once council members do that, that's determinative. Nobody's going to be cross-examining anybody. Do you really have a conflict of interest? And so I personally, from my seat, I'm glad to see this come forward. I support it. And it's something that's a great step for transparency and for accountability.
You beat me to the second half of my question. And then, just for clarification, Mr. Gaines, I know previously we've had council members who didn't turn a disclosure agreement in. That was not the case this go-around, is that right?
That's my understanding, is all the elected officials have turned in a conflict of interest.
And is there recourse if one of us chose not to? Not suggesting that's, I turned mine in, I'm just curious.
Well, not from staff, I'll tell you that. But that's something that actually elected officials are really going to have to police your own. I don't know what the recourse would be if an elected official elected not to.
Thanks.
And I did speak with Attorney Rogers on this a while back, just asked what is a real conflict, essentially what are the main things, and you can correct me if I misstate any of this, but the three main things were your employment, any business property you own, income property, and any boards, commissions, things you serve on where you have a deciding influence, were the three main ones that typically constitute a real conflict. I know, so there was discussion of, I think Aaron provided us, this is what you fill out for the state.
Right.
And then I think, so there's a couple options of, one could be looking at adopting something similar as a financial disclosure. It could just be changing our current form to be more specific about, here are things we're expecting you to list. Again, though, it does go back to our enforcement is really just our peer enforcement. There's really no legal enforcement on this.
But may I, Mr. Mayor? But to the point of Attorney Rogers, that I do think that transparency is what's important, because ultimately our accountability is to the people and the voters. And so, in my opinion, we should inform them to the best of our ability and be required to inform them about those things that strike at the heart of the three matters that you were talking about that could pose actual conflicts. And I'm not married to the form, the example that I provided, just by way of example. It would need to be tailored to fit our city and whatever the council would see fit. But I do think for tonight's purposes, in lieu of a referral, it is important to look at this form again and have a more detailed approach to our disclosures to the public.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilmember Dunn?
I think about when I filled out my first conflict of interest form with the city, it wasn't so much that I intended to do anything. I think what I like about this, I guess, is what I'm getting at is that if you're not sure, you're not thinking like what might be a conflict of interest, this gives you a little more guidance while you're sitting there going through the process of filling out those forms. So I appreciate that part. If it just asks me, I can just think and put it down or not.
Any other thoughts from council members?
Mr. Mayor,
Councilmember Cruz?
I know Kevin and I had spoke about this 5-6 years ago when I first started on council. I checked with outside counsel at that time as well. Because of a person's background, you're in situations where you know quite a bit about something, which then guides you to make better decisions potentially and have better rationale. Some people perceive that as a conflict because then what my knowledge base is different than city policy. And as was said here, that even on our business cards, it says our citizens are our business. So we represent the citizens, and if we need to change city policy, then that's what I strive to do for the best interest of the citizens. And I get a little flack on that because of my background. And I studied a lot of things in a lot of areas as a business analyst. So I have no problem disclosing it, but there might be people expecting me to recuse myself when, just because I know a lot about certain things, doesn't make it a conflict. Just makes me a more knowledgeable city councilor.
I do think that we're kind of talking two separate things between disclosure and recusing. Disclosure is, like you said, just the
Well, it
putting it down.
implies that you would recuse when something's coming up that might be on your disclosure form. You know, if I own a farm and we talk about farm rent for the city's farm, I have a knowledge base there that would help make a good decision for the city. That wouldn't mean I would recuse myself because I own a farm.
Correct.
So,
Mr. Mayor? Sorry,
Councilmember Dunn.
I don't take it that way. I take it as where I would maybe recuse myself is if myself or my spouse, someone in my immediate family had something personal to gain. I don't think it's because you have a knowledge base. I think it's more, in my ethics, it'd be, would there be a direct personal gain here, or something that would directly affect my immediate family, I guess is how I look at it.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilmember Ganfield.
I think just processing some thoughts as we go here. I have disclosed my conflicts, which my wife is a personal trainer. I don't have any business or other real property besides my home here in the city, so I have nothing to gain from arguing against this change, but I don't see the huge benefit of forcing councilpersons to do that extra disclosure, predominantly for a couple reasons. One, the conflict of interest form that we're using now has been successful forever, up until the last term where the mayor did call out a councilperson who didn't file their conflict of interest. For that offense, as Mr. Gaines pointed out, there is recourse. 5 electors could ask for the removal of any one of us if we're not being honest about those disclosures. And then that would go to a hearing, and then we would be the judge on that. There's a process to remove somebody if they're not abiding by this agreement of the conflict of interest. I'd be in favor, I guess, of shoring up some of the specificity that needs to be there, especially for newly electeds that need to know, what does this mean? What constitutes a bona fide conflict of interest? Because I think we have to fill this out before we ever do the Allers and Cooney presentation. My first time on council, when they presented, I had already gone to the Municipal Leadership Academy and heard about what is a bona fide conflict of interest, and I asked a clarifying question. Down here in Cedar Falls, we have Chocolaterie Stam. If I were the owner of a chocolate shop on Main Street and we were deliberating about whether to allow eateries on Main Street, I would not have a conflict of interest because I am a representative citizen amongst other restaurateurs. So I could vote on that. If we were discussing an ordinance banning chocolate distributors on Main Street, I would have to recuse myself because I stand a unique impact from that ordinance. So to Kelly's point, I think is right. The unique personal impact is what is a bona fide conflict of interest. But as Kevin would always advise, probably best to err on the side of caution and list everything you have, every stake in the game, so that people know, hey, that seems suspicious, and then people have a recourse for that. I'm not in favor of moving directly to this, and I don't think, Aaron, you're arguing for this particular form, but something that maybe guides us a little bit better as to that bona fide conflict of interest that Allers and Cooney might talk us through, or refill out the conflict of interest as soon as you know that you didn't disclose all potential conflicts of interest. It doesn't have to be only once a year. You could fill it out as you own new businesses throughout the year. So we could just hold ourselves accountable, I assume. That's my 2 cents on it.
Mr. Mayor, if I can, but I don't want to speak because I've spoken twice. It looks like Gil has something to say.
Well, first off, I want to know, I thought Mr. Ganfield, you had a yellow cake factory.
See what you did there?
beat me to it.
Somebody had to comment.
Somebody had to do it.
I just sent that video to a resident today.
Oh. Guys, I need to get the video.
It's audio.
I'm in agreement that we need to do a change. Hesitant on how far we go into family beyond ourselves, because again, could be a long road on, okay, where is it perceived or that. I'd also be curious on what other cities, like cities, are doing, not what the state is doing necessarily, but what the other cities are doing.
Mr. Mayor?
Well, first,
Oh,
Councilmember.
sorry, okay.
One second, Hobbaker, and then we'll come back.
Okay, thank you. To Councilman Ganfield's point, we always have a continuous duty to disclose as our lives change and as an issue is brought before us. But I think it goes to, Mr. Mayor, your point that this is just a disclosure form. It is not a conflict of interest form. It discloses where your interests lie, so that then we have that transparency we spoke of, so that when a review takes place, either by the council or the public or whomever, we have more information. So it is simply a disclosure form. The amount of detail, I think we can agree in the future, but I think it's clear from the form that we do have right now that it's lacking. So again, it's disclosure, and then it falls upon individual council members to say whether or not they think that their ethics should recuse them from a particular matter. And there's a difference to Councilman Cruz's point between a general knowledge and a specific to Councilmember Dunn's point, a specific pecuniary or financial interest in a decision. Ultimately, it's going to rely upon that council member or others, if it's that bad, that we have to call somebody to the carpet on it. But again, my proposal right now is simply a more detailed disclosure form.
Thank you. Councilmember Cruz?
Thank you. I guess to the question of how broad do we go with this, I think many disclosures like this, I know in my line of work, they always ask immediate family, and that's usually spouse, possibly parents, but then children, because that has a direct influence on investing and things that I do, advice for that. And I think it'd be very similar here, that a decision by immediate family members, or excuse me, a position of immediate family members could influence a counselor's direction that they go with their arguments and their votes. Then do we go so far as putting campaign contributions on here? I think that's a already mandated disclosure that should be possibly incorporated into this. I think it'd be wise to do that because that's really evident, or obvious, I should say.
Councilmember Lather?
Yeah, just in response to the campaign dollars, those are already reported through the state. So, I mean, you can look to see who many of us had contributions from pretty readily and have to actually maintain that as the year goes on. So, just point of clarification, what we're discussing tonight is whether or not we want staff to bring something forward as a more robust form, correct?
Yes.
I don't
We
think
need
we
to
need
make
to
a
get this
motion,
deep
but-
into the weeds then. I think it's the question is whether or not, yes, we want the staff to do this, or no, we don't. And as part of that, I guess, well, for one, I'd make a motion that yes, they should, but with the request that, I think the question was posed, what are other like-sized cities doing? If we could get an example of maybe what some others look like, because I think we are all in agreement that this is probably not enough, and maybe the level that Mr. Hawbaker needs to disclose as a state elected official maybe is too much. So there's probably a happy medium there. We don't probably need to reinvent the wheel. It's probably already out there, so it'd be nice to be able to react to that. So I'd make the motion that yes, staff should bring that forward.
Second.
Second.
So we have a motion and a second for staff to bring forward a more robust version of a conflict of interest form with some direction to look at some comparatives, other communities, what we're doing to help guide that. We have a motion and second. Any discussion?
Sounds good.
Seeing none, we need a roll call or a voice vote for this. So all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries.
Mayor, can I just jump in? I just want to clarify with the motion, and that is directing for elected officials only for the vote?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you for the clarification, Jen.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I guess if it's relevant that we look at the others, it wouldn't hurt.
Just look for
I
a,
think the,
I'm not, but that wasn't what I was voting on.
I was
I
voting,
was,
yeah.
what's in front of us, I thought was just electeds.
okay. Seeing no other motions? All right, moving on to item number 2. So it's for staff to bring forward to council a plan to utilize funding allocated in CIP for fiscal year 25 for proposals for changes to zoning and parking for the College Hill character areas 1, 2, and 3 as designated by the College Hill Vision Plan, similar to the character districts established for the downtown. No priority should be given to areas 1, 2, and 3. However, the impact and future possible changes to areas 4 and beyond should be included in the recommendations. And we have a presentation from Director Stephanie Sheets.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, council members. So I have just a couple slides that I'll use to cover the points from the memo that was in your packet. So we just kind of move through them in a broad overview, and then from there, any council discussion. It is split into zoning initiatives versus non-zoning initiatives. So I'll spend time on both of those. So starting with the zoning initiatives, the staff recommendation is that we focus on all of the areas on this slide, which are detailed further in the memo in the zoning work that we move forward with. And we would recommend hiring a consultant to help with that work because there is quite a bit of work involved in detail to what would happen here. What we also would suggest is that we evaluate this and then provide some preliminary feedback to the council, a great touch point between the consultant, council, staff before moving forward into drafting anything, and you'll see that also in the schedule. But for example, what is meant by focusing on updating the zoning and character areas 1, 2, and 3? I do have on the map here, hopefully fairly easy to read, but also in your packet, page 14 of the packet is the map that tries to show generally the boundary of character area 1, 2, and 3 from the College Hill Vision Plan, and then also shows zoning that's in place right now, along with the blue line, which is kind of hard to see, is the College Hill overlay existing. So there's a lot of information on this map, but trying to help you get some context of what falls where, because it can get confusing pretty quickly when we talk about character areas 1, 2, and 3, and we talk about the overlay and what's where. So I thought that the map would be a good orientation for that. But as far as what's involved in focusing on updating those areas, for example, we could start by having a public and stakeholder meetings just to revisit, because there has been some time since that plan was put together. And we've had some concerns about, well, have conditions changed, and should we discuss that? And did the community as a whole get a chance to discuss that? So we can certainly start with that step of determining if the community feels that what's in the plan is appropriate, or if there are other thoughts that need to be considered as a part of this. We would also then like to examine the current zoning boundaries and determine the location of these zoning boundaries. So there's been some initial discussion at the council table about that, of where this zoning line should be. We've given examples of some of the things that the consultants saw as challenges when they were here. And so reviewing the boundaries before getting into the work certainly seems to make some sense. And then evaluating and recommending the type of zoning to move forward with. Again, lots of discussion about what that should be. And so once we affirm where we're at in terms of the community's goals, then you start talking about what strategy makes sense to address that. Because it's not one size fits all. We know that zoning can be tailored, and we can use different types of zoning to approach different issues. So that's initially a little bit of what we see as what could be involved in that step, in that part of the project, I should say. Improving parking policies and regulations is another big bite for us to take. Lots of discussion about that one too, and lots of different opinions about what that is. But we do need to take a look at what the city and the UNI parking requirements are and how the approaches occur on those in terms of whether it be fees, who has accessibility to those, and does that create any mismatch that encourages use of one type of parking over the other, maybe creates a little bit of strain on the neighborhoods. All of that there's a lot that's feeding into the dynamic of what's happening with parking and what should be the parking requirement. And so we're recommending that a task force or some type of small committee with you and I to better coordinate with parking, talk about public and you and I parking requirements, and identify if we've got mismatches, and that helps to identify some strategies. That also then feeds into evaluating what would be the appropriate ratio of parking for private parking standards, which is where the zoning would regulate. And then zoning can also regulate, do we allow other tools? For example, can there be fees in lieu of providing the required parking? So you're putting into a fund to create more public parking. Those are all opportunities that we see happening in other cities. You have to put the math behind what your requirement is in order to adopt a requirement. So do we want to take that effort or not? Because we would want to know up front so that we know what to put into the consultants, into the RFP, looking for consultants, and then what goes into the contract. Evaluating the College Hill Overlay District, the memo indicates, for example, we should examine the standards in the overlay and determine if there are some updates that are needed, because as you can see from the map, the overlay does apply to a different area than just the character area 1, 2, and 3. And so let's take a look at that. Let's make sure the standards are clear and objective. I think there's a lot of feeling that there is some value in that code, and we want to make sure that we maintain that value and appropriately apply it to areas where it is needed. Also look at, are there ways that we can simplify that? The council has seen in front of you several issues that are fairly minor in staff's opinion about, I want to put up a new garage, I want to fix my porch, and they have to go through the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council. And so are those small examples of an investment that we want to encourage to happen, but we have a difficult process to get through? Are our policies encouraging reinvestment or not? So those are some of the things that we should think about. And finally, stabilizing neighborhood areas. We want to make sure that any work that is done is considering the dynamic that we have of rental to owner occupied. And we feel, that's unique in a college town to have that type of dynamic to the degree that we have it, and particularly in the neighborhood where we're talking about doing the work. And so we need to make sure that we understand that, and that any consultant that we have understands that as well. And so understanding that ratio of rental to owner occupied is important. We also put forward in the memo that the R1 and R2 districts have a lot of value. They're very prevalent throughout our community. People know the regulations well, but we've also had people say, hey, I want to do an accessory dwelling unit. The only place I can do that right now is in the downtown. I want to be able to do it at my house on Round, or my house on Cedar Heights, or whatever. So should we look at that and continue to expand that opportunity and test how that works? Should we apply the overlay to a little bit more of the surrounding areas? What are we hearing about that? Again, in that dynamic that we have of rental to owner occupied, do we want to think about how the overlay is a tool that helps with some of the issues that can come up? But maybe there are other zoning strategies as well that a consultant can help us with. So in a nutshell, that's the zoning initiatives part of the memo and what staff's putting forward as a potential plan. It is a very long time frame to move through this work. This time frame is similar to what it took to do the downtown code. If there are areas that you want to talk about, do we really need to do, for example, the public and stakeholder meetings that add 2 to 3 months to the process? If you're wanting to shorten that up, those are certainly things that the council could talk about. But we do want to make sure that there's adequate time put into drafting the code, and also just as much and actually more time during the public review of it at the Planning and Zoning Commission, good deliberation and consideration about what's being put forward, and the same opportunity for the City Council. So that does end up taking quite a bit of time. Lastly, other initiatives, just to recognize that there are other things outside of zoning that certainly can be done and should continue to be thought about in terms of continuing rental code enforcement. I think that that has been something that the council has supported and wanted us to make sure that we're working on maintenance-related items and occupancy levels, and that's an ongoing work that occurs. There have been thoughts about should we expand the rental-to-owner conversion program, thoughts about what level of funding is appropriate there. Thoughts about whether we should widen sidewalks, add street trees. That's something that the College Hill Vision Plan puts forward, and certainly we consider that as we do reconstruction projects, if those are elements that can be worked into a project. And if that's value for the council, that can certainly be a continuing effort. That takes years to implement that type of thing. But also coming back to if there's value in reinvesting in streetscape like we did in the downtown, those are all non-zoning related initiatives that the council can consider. With that, I have others listed there, but I don't know that I need to go into all of those. They are in the memo, and I'd be happy to answer any questions from the council.
Open up to questions, comments.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilmember Cruz.
just a quick thought, and I think Ashitu mentioned it, the other initiative list, many of those are ongoing throughout the city, you know, the bike patrol or the bike committee, outdoor spaces when we talk about our parks, so on. So I guess these are.
Yeah, and I listed, kind of wanted to recognize that in terms of the outdoor spaces investments, the memo notes Pedersen Plaza was completed in 2023, Searly Park is anticipated 24-25, 23rd Street east of College Street is identified as a flexible gathering space. We have ongoing projects happening in the Dry Run Creek watershed, so yeah, lots of investment happening there.
And so I think for tonight, then we'll be looking for just motion and direction to staff to either move forward with this as planned. Wanted to discuss, I know timeline was some conversation of, there's a lot of public input built into this by intent to make sure that that's knowing too, we've had several years since the original vision plan was done. There might be a need for some of that re-input. So some of this is kind of redoing some of that public input since we're a few years out from those original conversations. I know there was some things I had questioned on, like ADUs, if that was something we were all in agreement on. Is that something we'd want to wait the full 2 years, or are there pieces of this we might want to say move forward with that before this is all done? But just wanted to make sure everyone, how you felt on the timeline of this, as well as the content.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Cruz.
If anybody else wants. The ADU thing can be separate, it can be citywide rather easily. You know, so I think I would not want to short circuit the process here where you have input from the public stakeholders, because a lot of this was pre-COVID or during COVID, and the dynamic of retail downtown environments have changed dramatically. Work from home has dramatically increased, so office space in a downtown environment or a area of town has changed. So yeah, I think there's good value in opening it up again for an ongoing discussion.
Okay. Councilmember Hotbaker.
Yeah, I have a question. So as I understand it, at least the first thing we need to do to begin this process, and what do we have, 16 steps essentially, right? But the first one is the consultant services, right? And then obviously, this is the best guess about when the next steps would take place, subject to change, subject to additional input from the council after we hear back from the consultant and we develop the RFP. Is that right?
Correct.
So for purposes for staff then tonight, I mean, obviously it's a general, those steps look great, but do you need a more specific referral as it relates to action item 1 on this list, or what are you looking for?
I think out of tonight is to hear from council if you think this plan of these ideas that I conveyed from the memo are on target for what you would be looking for with the work, because we would put that into the request for qualifications and proposals. And then, yes, so that's part 1 maybe, and then part 2 would be, should we go ahead and move forward with drafting that so that we can try to meet this schedule?
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Mayor, if I could just jump in real quick. And the other thing to remember is once that RFP selection and we bring back a contract, you'll see the outline within the contract as well that'll, go into the depth and the scope of services and what their timing is and all of that. So that's another decision point that the council will have.
Any other questions, comments?
I guess one thing, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
When we look at consultants to choose from and send out RFPs, we have a broad range of thoughts on whether we have traditional zoning or Euclidean zoning versus form-based zoning versus what many call a hybrid of multiple components of each. And I think it's important we get a consultant that can cover all of those and not just be one or the other.
The council will vote on that contract.
I'm supportive of, I say let's get going. So I'm supportive of this, knowing that every single thing will come back in front of us again. So let's get the ball rolling and make some progress is how I feel. If there's, as far as the accessory dwelling units, I mean, I don't want to put anything in a bad position as far as somebody saying they didn't have a chance to weigh in on it. Now, I will say this, I remember specifically a person who came and spoke at this council meeting before this current council was elected saying that I believe the story was they had purchased a home and were quite surprised that that wasn't allowed in our city. So, I'm not saying that has to go either way, but there are folks, I believe, that would like that as an option. And I'd be okay if as the one of 7 that we get that ball rolling sooner than later. I'd be okay with getting the ball rolling on many of these other steps, but knowing that right now we have to have it budgeted. But as far as getting stuff improved, as far as the streetscape and stuff up there, I don't know if sometimes when you walk down the hill, there's a couple spots where if you don't pick your feet up high, you're going to trip and fall. So I do worry about that and a lot. So I'm supportive. I'll make the motion to carry out as proposed in this presentation, is that specific enough?
Second. Yeah, I'll use the memo.
So we have a motion and second, and
a second.
And second. And open up any more conversation.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilmember.
What's our funding that we're talking about here? Dollar amount?
So in our CIP, 100,000 is listed in fiscal 25 and 26 for this work.
For each year, 100,000
No, total.
total? And that's supposed to cover zoning for the whole city or just this?
No, just this.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments from council? And
I just want to thank Director Sheets for putting this together. I think this is a lot of good information. I think it answers a lot of the calls from our public for things that they want to see and focus on, and I'm looking forward to getting to work on it.
Thank you.
and last call. Otherwise, we'll open up for public comment as well. Name and city, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Jim Brown, Cedar Falls. I did not plan on coming and speaking tonight. I had some other work to do, so I'd looked a lot prettier if I knew I was going to come. I'm speaking tonight basically on behalf of the Cedar Falls Economic Development Corporation. Just a few quick points that wouldn't surprise any of you, but collectively developers are looking for a few different things. One is consistency, hopefully in this instance, expediency, and I just would ask you as you go through this process, especially as it relates to parking, we're way behind on this project, folks. We're way behind. Back in 2018, a project was being proposed and basically got delayed for a year. It finally got approved, but a $14-some million project got turned down and delayed because of 30 parking spots. And now look at the Hill. The Hill doesn't have a parking problem. Downtown has a perceived parking problem. I think we all agree that which we would prefer in terms of development. I would ask you folks to please trust the process, trust staff, P&Z. Don't get bogged down on this one. Let's hopefully move through a number of different steps because we are way far behind. So thank you for your work and your attention on this so far.
Thank you, Jim. Any other public comment for this item? Name and city, please.
It's Chris Martin, and I'm the interim president of the College Hill Partnership, and from Cedar Falls, and live in the College Hill neighborhood at 421 West Searly. I just wanted to thank all the members of the council for this and getting this through. There's still a couple years ahead of us on this, but I appreciate starting the process. I think it'll actually be really good for the Hill and for the university and the other stakeholders in that area too. So that's my main message. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else? All right, seeing none, we have a motion and second to approve staff moving forward with this as outlined. We need a voice vote, so all those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. I will quick, if it's okay, since I forgot to open up public comment for the first item, just in case, does anybody have any public comment on the conflict of interest form conversation that we had earlier? All right, seeing none, I will move then to adjourn.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Council.
Before we move to adjourn, I would like to make a motion to refer on that accessory dwelling unit in R1 and R2, if that goes to P and Z for dialogue to develop that ordinance. Is that something we could fit in the budget? Like to move on that earlier than this timeline to get ADUs
So
potentially.
the ADU
discussed?
may be something that we can do in-house if it's small enough. So.
Yeah, I think I'd move that we refer that to them.
Can we do that if it wasn't on the agenda for?
It was no final council action, so it's just a referral to staff to work on something. You could pick up the phone too, so it's
Yep.
fine.
Okay, cool.
Okay. So we have a motion and second
Second.
to have staff look at ADUs. Any discussion? Any public comment? Seeing none, look for a voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. All right, unless any other conversation, we'll look to adjourn, and we will be back at 7 o'clock for the regular city council meeting. Thank you, everyone.